Heel to toe. Keep going.
1, 2, 3.
Good. Now lift your right leg. Count out loud.
1001, 1002, 1003.
All right, go ahead and breathe into this for me.
Okay.
0.00. See that?
Yeah, man.
That's what I was saying.
I'm good.
All right, stay right there. Hands behind your back.
The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the Ashford College library, casting their pale glow across rows of empty study carrels. It was late, nearly 11:30 on a Thursday night in mid-September, and most students had long since retreated to their dormitories or gathered in off-campus apartments for the kind of socializing that typically marks college life. But not everyone followed that pattern. Not everyone fit the mold that society sometimes tries to impose on young people, particularly young men, particularly college athletes. In a corner of the second floor, hunched over a biology textbook with highlighters scattered around him like fallen soldiers, sat a young man named Derek Thomas Holloway. At 20 years old, Derek represented something increasingly rare in the world of collegiate athletics. He was genuinely, almost stubbornly, committed to doing things the right way. While his teammates might spend their Thursday nights at house parties or downtown bars with fake identification cards tucked into their wallets, Derek preferred the quiet companionship of his studies. It wasn't that he judged his peers for their choices. He simply had different priorities, different values instilled in him by parents who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities they never had. Derek served as the starting place kicker for the Ashford College Pioneers, a small Division II program located in the quiet town of Millbrook, Georgia. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where Friday night football games at the local high school still drew crowds that rivaled church attendance on Sunday mornings. Millbrook sat nestled in the foothills of northern Georgia, about 90 miles northwest of Atlanta, far enough from the city to maintain its small-town character, but close enough to attract students seeking affordable education away from urban distractions. If you're the kind of person who follows stories about how the justice system sometimes fails ordinary citizens, I'd encourage you to stay with me through this entire account. What happened to Derek Holloway on this particular September night represents something that could happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time, and the implications of what he experienced should concern every single one of us who believes in the fundamental principles of fairness and due process. Derek closed his biology textbook with a soft thud, the sound barely registering in the empty library. He had been studying for nearly 4 hours, preparing for an exam scheduled for the following Monday. His eyes ached from the strain of reading dense paragraphs about cellular respiration and mitochondrial function. He reached for the half-empty can of energy drink sitting beside his notebook, the condensation leaving a small ring on the wooden table surface. This was his vice, if you could call it that. While other students his age might unwind with alcohol or experiment with substances that clouded judgment and impaired performance, Derek's most significant indulgence was the occasional caffeinated beverage that helped him power through late-night study sessions. He gathered his materials methodically, sliding the textbook into his worn backpack alongside 2 spiral notebooks filled with neat handwriting. Derek had always been organized, always been the kind of person who planned ahead and considered consequences. His father, a construction foreman back in St. Augustine who worked 60-hour weeks to support his family, had drilled into him the importance of preparation. The game isn't won on the field, his father would say during their backyard practice sessions years ago. It's won in the hours nobody sees, the moments when you're doing the right thing even when nobody's watching. Those words echoed in Derek's mind as he made his way down the library's central staircase, his footsteps soft against the carpeted treads. The building was nearly deserted now, with only a single librarian visible at the circulation desk, her attention focused on a computer screen as she processed returned materials. Derek offered her a polite wave as he passed, receiving a tired smile in return. Outside, the September air carried the first hints of autumn coolness, a welcome relief after the oppressive humidity of the Georgia summer. The library parking lot sat adjacent to the main building, separated by a narrow sidewalk lined with ornamental bushes that the groundskeeping staff kept meticulously trimmed. At this hour, the lot held perhaps a dozen vehicles, most of them belonging to the few remaining students and staff members still working inside. Derek's vehicle, a silver 2014 Honda Civic that he had purchased with money saved from summer jobs and a small contribution from his grandparents, sat near the back of the lot. The car wasn't flashy or impressive. It was practical, reliable, and paid for in full. Those were the qualities Derek valued. He walked toward his car with the unhurried gait of someone who had no reason to rush, his mind still partially occupied with the material he had just studied. The parking lot lighting left something to be desired, with several of the overhead lamps either burned out or flickering intermittently. Derek made a mental note to mention this to campus security during his next encounter with them. It seemed like the kind of thing someone should address, especially with fall arriving and the days growing shorter. As he approached his vehicle, Derek's attention was drawn to a text message notification on his phone. His mother checking in as she always did, wanting to know if he had eaten dinner and whether he was getting enough sleep. He smiled at the screen, typing out a quick response with one hand while fishing his keys from his pocket with the other. It was this momentary distraction, this split second of divided attention, that would set in motion a chain of events capable of derailing everything he had worked so hard to build. Derek settled into the driver's seat, tossing his backpack onto the passenger side and adjusting his rearview mirror out of habit. He started the engine, the familiar hum of the Civic's four-cylinder motor, providing a sense of comfort after the hours of intense studying. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. If he headed straight back to his dormitory, he could still get a reasonable night's sleep before his 8 a.m. economics lecture. He shifted the car into reverse and began backing out of the parking space, his attention focused on the rear-view camera display that showed the area behind his vehicle. What Derek couldn't see, what the camera angle failed to capture adequately, was the dark-colored sedan parked at an angle in the adjacent row. The vehicle belonged to a faculty member who had, for reasons unknown, chosen to park across two spaces rather than within the designated lines. In the dim lighting of the lot, with his mind still processing cellular biology concepts, Derek simply didn't register the proximity of the other car until he felt the sickening crunch of metal meeting metal. The impact wasn't severe. Derek had been traveling at perhaps 3 miles per hour, the kind of speed that characterizes careful parking lot navigation, but the sound was unmistakable, the kind of noise that makes your stomach drop and your heart rate spike instantaneously. He slammed the brake pedal, bringing his Civic to an immediate stop, and sat frozen for a moment as the reality of what had happened washed over him. In that moment, Derek Holloway faced a choice that would define the trajectory of the coming weeks. He could have simply driven away. The parking lot was nearly empty. There were no obvious witnesses. The lighting made it unlikely that any security cameras would have captured clear footage of the incident. He could have retreated to his dormitory and hoped that no one would connect his vehicle to the damage. Plenty of people, perhaps even most people, might have considered that option at least fleetingly. But Derek wasn't most people. His parents hadn't raised him to take the easy way out when the easy way meant abandoning his principles. He thought about his father, working those long hours in the Florida sun, building houses for other families while scraping together enough money to give his own children a better life. He thought about his mother, who worked the night shift at a nursing home and still managed to make breakfast for him and his younger sister every morning before school. They had taught him that character wasn't measured by what you did when everyone was watching. It was measured by what you did when no one was watching. Derek turned off his engine and stepped out of the vehicle to assess the damage. The rear bumper of his Civic showed a notable dent, the kind that would require professional attention but wasn't catastrophic. More concerning was the damage to the other vehicle, a late-model Buick sedan whose front quarter panel now bore a significant scrape, along with a cracked headlight assembly. This wasn't minor damage. This was the kind of collision that would cost hundreds of dollars to repair properly. He pulled out his phone and did something that many people in his position would consider unnecessary or even foolish. He called campus security, not because he expected praise for his honesty, not because he thought it would somehow benefit him in the long run. He called because it was simply the right thing to do, and Derek Holloway had been raised to believe that doing the right thing mattered even when it was inconvenient. The campus security dispatcher answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the slightly bored tone of someone working a quiet overnight shift. Derek explained the situation clearly and calmly, providing his location, a description of both vehicles, and his assessment of the damage involved. The dispatcher informed him that she would send a security officer to his location and suggested he also contact the Millbrook Police Department, since the incident would need to be documented through official channels for insurance purposes. What happened next would haunt Derek Holloway for months to come. It would threaten his athletic career, his academic standing, and his reputation in a community where such things mattered deeply. And it would expose uncomfortable truths about the way certain systems in our society operate, about the enormous power that individual officers wield, and about how easy it is to have your life upended when someone in authority decides to exercise that power carelessly or maliciously. The Millbrook police cruiser arrived approximately 15 minutes after Derek's call, its headlights cutting through the darkness of the parking lot like accusatory beams. Behind the wheel sat Officer Marcus Whitfield, a 12-year veteran of the department who had transferred from a larger jurisdiction near Savannah several years earlier. Whitfield was known within the department for his aggressive approach to traffic enforcement, particularly DUI investigations. He prided himself on his instincts, on his ability to identify impaired drivers based on subtle cues that other officers might miss. Derek watched the cruiser approach, a slight knot forming in his stomach despite his certainty that he had done nothing wrong. There was something about police presence that created unease even in the most innocent of citizens, a subconscious response to authority that perhaps dates back to childhood experiences of being caught in minor transgressions. He reminded himself that he had called for this. He had invited official scrutiny because he wanted to handle the situation properly. Officer Whitfield emerged from his vehicle slowly, taking a moment to survey the scene before approaching Derek. He was a man of medium build, perhaps in his early 40s, with close-cropped brown hair showing the first hints of gray at the temples. His uniform was pressed and immaculate, his equipment belt organized with military precision. Everything about his appearance suggested a man who took his position seriously, perhaps too seriously. I want to pause here and ask you something important. As you're listening to this story unfold, try to imagine yourself in Derek's shoes. You've just done the responsible thing by reporting a minor accident. You're a college student with a clean record, someone who has never been in trouble with the law. How would you feel watching that police car pull up? What would be going through your mind? The officer approached Derek's position near the damaged vehicles, his flashlight beam sweeping across the scene before settling on the young man's face. Derek squinted slightly against the glare, but maintained his composure, extending his hand in greeting before realizing that such informality might not be appropriate in this context. "Evening, officer," Derek said, his voice steady but carrying a hint of the nervousness that anyone would feel in such circumstances. "I'm the one who called about the accident." Officer Whitfield didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let his gaze travel slowly over Derek, taking in details that most observers would consider unremarkable. The young man was dressed casually in jeans and a university sweatshirt, his hair slightly disheveled from hours of studying. His backpack sat visible on the passenger seat of the Civic through the still open driver's door. Nothing about his appearance suggested intoxication or criminal activity. Nothing except perhaps the simple fact of his youth and his presence in a college parking lot close to midnight. "Let me see your license and registration," the officer said, his tone flat and businesslike. Derek nodded and reached into his back pocket for his wallet, a movement he announced verbally before executing to ensure there was no misunderstanding. He had heard stories, everyone had, about encounters that escalated because of sudden movements or miscommunication. He was determined to do everything possible to keep this interaction smooth and professional. As he handed over his documentation, Derek noticed the officer studying him with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances. Whitfield accepted the license, examined it under his flashlight, then directed the beam back toward Derek's face once more. "You been drinking tonight?" The question came suddenly, without preamble, as if the officer had been waiting for the right moment to deploy it. Derek felt a flash of confusion followed by something approaching indignation, though he suppressed the latter emotion quickly. "No, sir, not at all. I don't drink." It was the truth. Stated simply, and without elaboration, Derek Holloway genuinely did not consume alcohol. It wasn't a religious conviction or a moral stance he felt compelled to impose on others. It was simply a personal choice, one rooted in his commitment to athletic performance and his observations of how alcohol had affected certain family members in his extended circle. His grandfather on his mother's side had struggled with alcoholism for decades before finally achieving sobriety, and that family history had left an impression on young Derek that shaped his own choices. Officer Whitfield's expression didn't change at this declaration. If anything, his skepticism seemed to deepen, as if Derek's denial only confirmed whatever suspicions had already formed in his mind. "Step out here for me," the officer instructed, gesturing toward a more open area of the parking lot where the lighting was marginally better. "I want to conduct some tests." Derek's confusion intensified. He had called to report a minor fender bender, an accident caused by a momentary lapse in attention while backing out of a parking space. Now he was being treated as a potential criminal, subjected to procedures that seemed entirely disconnected from the nature of his call. "Tests?" Derek repeated, the word emerging as a question. "I don't understand. I wasn't drinking. I was studying in the library all night." "That's what they all say," Whitfield responded, his voice carrying an edge of condescension that made Derek's stomach tighten. "You just let me do my job, and if you haven't done anything wrong, you've got nothing to worry about." It was a phrase that gets repeated countless times in police encounters across this country, a seemingly reasonable assurance that carries implicit promises of fairness and objectivity. If you're innocent, the logic suggests, then cooperation will lead to vindication. What this phrase fails to acknowledge is the enormous power differential inherent in such encounters, the reality that an officer's subjective interpretation can override objective truth, the fact that sometimes doing nothing wrong isn't enough to protect you from consequences you don't deserve. Derek complied, because what choice did he have? He stepped away from his vehicle and positioned himself where Officer Whitfield indicated, the cool September air raising goosebumps on his arms despite the sweatshirt he wore. Behind him, the damaged vehicles sat as silent witnesses to an encounter that was rapidly transforming from a routine accident report into something far more consequential. The first test Whitfield administered was a preliminary breath test, producing a small, handheld device from his equipment belt and instructing Derek on how to blow into it properly. Derek followed the instructions carefully, having nothing to hide and everything to prove. He exhaled steadily into the device, maintaining the effort until the officer indicated he could stop. The result came back 0.00, complete sobriety. Not a trace of alcohol in Derek Holloway's system. Most reasonable people would consider this result definitive. When someone blows a perfect zero on a breath test, the logical conclusion is that they haven't been drinking. But Officer Whitfield was not prepared to accept this outcome. In his mind, apparently, the absence of alcohol didn't preclude the presence of other substances, and where evidence didn't exist to support his suspicions, he seemed determined to manufacture it through alternative means. "We're going to do some field sobriety tests," the officer announced, his tone suggesting this was a foregone conclusion rather than a response to any actual indication of impairment. Derek felt a wave of frustration wash over him, though he kept his expression neutral. He had never been subjected to field sobriety testing before, had only seen such procedures depicted in television dramas where the subjects were inevitably stumbling and slurring. He knew he was completely sober, knew that any legitimate test would confirm what the breath test had already proven. But there was something deeply unsettling about the situation, a sense that he had lost control of the narrative in a way that made rational outcomes uncertain. The first test Whitfield administered was the Horizontal Gaze Nystagmus Evaluation, commonly abbreviated as HGN. This test involves tracking a stimulus, usually a pen or small light, with the eyes while keeping the head stationary. The officer looks for involuntary jerking of the eyes at certain angles, a phenomenon that can indicate intoxication or impairment from various substances. Derek fixed his gaze on the tip of Officer Whitfield's pen as instructed, following it smoothly from side to side while keeping his head perfectly still. His eyes tracked the stimulus without hesitation or difficulty, the smooth pursuit movement indicating normal neurological function. At no point did his eyes exhibit the telltale bouncing or jerking that the test was designed to detect. He passed this evaluation as definitively as humanly possible. Yet Officer Whitfield made notes on his pad without offering any indication of the result. His face remained impassive, revealing nothing about his assessment of Derek's performance. This lack of feedback created an uncomfortable uncertainty, a sense that Derek was being evaluated against criteria he couldn't access or understand. "Okay, now I want you to take 9 steps forward, heel to toe. touching the heel of one foot to the toe of the other with each step. Whitfield instructed, count each step out loud, then turn around in a specific way and take 9 steps back. The walk and turn test is considered one of the standardized field sobriety evaluations, designed to assess divided attention by requiring the subject to listen to instructions while performing a physical task. Derek listened carefully as the officer explained the proper turning technique, wanting to execute the test flawlessly despite his growing frustration with the entire situation. He began walking, counting aloud with each step. 1, 2, 3. His feet connected precisely, heel to toe, maintaining a straight line across the parking lot surface. 4, 5, 6. The night air felt thick around him, weighted with consequence despite his certainty of innocence. 7, 8, 9. He executed the turn exactly as instructed, pivoting on one foot while taking small steps with the other, then began his return journey with the same methodical precision. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7, 9. Derek completed the test without a single misstep, without swaying, without touching the ground for balance, without any of the indicators that would suggest impairment. He had performed the walk and turn as well as anyone could possibly perform it. Yet, when he looked at Officer Whitfield's face, he saw no acknowledgement of this fact. I observed one clue, the officer stated, making another notation on his pad. Derek's brow furrowed. What clue? I did exactly what you told me to do. Whitfield didn't explain. He simply moved on to the next test, the one-leg stand, instructing Derek to raise one foot approximately 6 inches off the ground and count aloud in a specific cadence until told to stop. This was perhaps the simplest of the standardized tests, requiring nothing more than basic balance and the ability to count. Derek raised his left foot, maintaining his balance on his right leg, with the kind of stability that came from years of athletic training. As a place kicker, he spent countless hours working on balance and body control, the foundational skills that allowed him to consistently strike a football through the uprights from significant distances. 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000, Derek counted, his voice steady and his posture rock solid. He continued past 10, past 15, watching Officer Whitfield from the corner of his eye and wondering what possible objection could be raised against such a flawless performance. Okay, put your foot down, Whitfield finally said, making yet another note. Derek lowered his foot, his confusion now bordering on alarm. He had just completed 3 field sobriety tests with what he knew. What anyone watching would have known was perfect execution. Combined with the 0 reading on the breath test, there was absolutely no legitimate basis for any suspicion of impairment. Yet the officer's demeanor suggested that these results meant nothing, that conclusions had already been drawn and evidence was merely a formality to be interpreted accordingly. I want to take a moment here to discuss something important about field sobriety testing that most people don't fully understand. These tests, despite being called standardized, are far from objective measures of impairment. Studies have shown that even trained officers frequently misidentify sober individuals as impaired based on field sobriety test performance. One study published in a respected medical journal found that law enforcement officers classified nearly half of completely sober test subjects as being impaired. Think about that for a moment. Almost 50% of people who had consumed nothing were still deemed impaired based on an officer's subjective interpretation of their test performance. The problem lies not necessarily with the tests themselves, but with the enormous discretion officers have in interpreting results. What constitutes one clue on a walk and turn test? How slight does an imbalance have to be before it becomes a failure? These determinations are made by individual officers in real time, often under imperfect conditions, and they can be influenced by countless factors including the officer's pre-existing suspicions, their training background, their mood, their personal biases, and their motivations in any given encounter. Derek Holloway stood in that parking lot having passed every objective measure of sobriety with flying colors. Yet Officer Marcus Whitfield had apparently decided that this young man was impaired, and he seemed determined to find or manufacture evidence to support that predetermined conclusion. There was one more test to administer. The Romberg balance test, while not part of the standardized field sobriety test battery, is sometimes used by officers seeking additional indicators of impairment. The test requires the subject to stand with feet together, head tilted slightly back, and eyes closed while estimating the passage of 30 seconds. Close your eyes and tilt your head back, Whitfield instructed. When you think 30 seconds has passed, tell me to stop and look up. Derek complied, closing his eyes against the night sky and beginning his internal count. Without visual references, time becomes elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that can be difficult to calibrate. Derek focused, drawing on the same concentration that allowed him to block out crowd noise and execute under pressure during football games. He counted silently, trying to maintain a steady rhythm in his mind. "Stop," he said, when he believed 30 seconds had elapsed. He opened his eyes to find Officer Whitfield consulting his watch. 33 seconds, the officer announced. That's outside the acceptable range. Derek felt something cold settle in his chest. He had estimated 30 seconds and been off by 3 seconds. On a test with no visual or auditory cues, performed late at night after hours of studying, he had come within 3 seconds of perfect accuracy. The idea that this constituted a failure was absurd on its face, yet here was an officer of the law documenting it as evidence of impairment. "How is that a failure?" Derek asked, unable to contain his bewilderment any longer. 3 seconds. I was basically perfect." Officer Whitfield's expression remained unchanged. "The acceptable range is 25 to 35 seconds, but being on the high end combined with other observations suggests impairment." "What other observations?" Derek's voice rose slightly, frustration finally breaking through his carefully maintained composure. "I blew zeros on the breath test. I did everything you asked perfectly. I'm completely sober. I was studying in the library all night." The officer regarded him with something that might have been irritation, or perhaps merely the impassive professionalism of someone accustomed to protestations of innocence. "Sir, based on my training and experience, I believe you are impaired by some substance. I'm placing you under arrest for DUI." The words hung in the cool night air like a sentence handed down from some arbitrary tribunal, disconnected from evidence or reason. Derek Holloway, a college student who didn't drink, who didn't smoke, who didn't use drugs, who had done nothing more than back into a parked car while leaving the library after a study session, was being arrested for driving under the influence. His mind raced through the implications even as Officer Whitfield produced handcuffs and began reciting the familiar words of the Miranda warning. This would go on his record. This would affect his standing with the football team. This could impact his scholarship, his academic status, his entire future, and all because one officer had decided, against all available evidence, that he must be intoxicated. "You're making a mistake," Derek said quietly as the cold metal encircled his wrists. It wasn't a threat or a challenge. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered with the weary certainty of someone who recognizes that facts don't always matter when power has already made its determination. "That's for the courts to decide," Whitfield responded, the phrase carrying an almost philosophical resignation, as if the officer himself recognized that his role was merely to initiate processes that others would ultimately resolve. But that resolution, whatever it might eventually be, would come only after Derek had been processed, photographed, and confined. After his name had been entered into systems that would follow him indefinitely, after the damage had already been done. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to have your life suddenly veer off course through no fault of your own, to watch helplessly as authority figures make decisions that you know to be wrong, then you might have some appreciation for what Derek Holloway experienced as he was guided into the back of that police cruiser. The leather seat was cold against his hands, still bound behind his back. The protective barrier separating the front and rear compartments cast shadows across his face as passing streetlights alternated with darkness. He thought about calling his parents, but dreaded the conversation. How do you explain to people who have sacrificed everything for your success that you've been arrested on charges you know to be false? How do you convey the surreal quality of an experience where your innocence seems to count for nothing against the weight of an officer's suspicion? The drive to the Millbrook County Detention Facility took approximately 20 minutes, long enough for Derek to cycle through several stages of emotional response. Initial shock gave way to anger, which in turn subsided into a kind of determined resignation. He would get through this. He would be vindicated. The truth would eventually emerge. These affirmations played on repeat in his mind, a mantra against the growing despair that threatened to overwhelm him. At the detention facility, Derek was processed with the impersonal efficiency of a system designed to handle volume rather than individual circumstances. He was photographed. He was fingerprinted. His personal belongings were cataloged and placed into a manila envelope that would be returned to him upon release. Through it all, he maintained his composure, answering questions politely and complying with all instructions. Even in this moment of profound injustice, Derek Holloway remained the person his parents had raised him to be. The holding cell was small and spartanly furnished, with a metal bench along one wall and a toilet lacking any privacy screen in the corner. Derek was the sole occupant, a small mercy that allowed him to process his circumstances without the additional stress of strangers observing his distress. He sat on the bench, his back against the cold cinder-block wall, and allowed himself finally to feel the full weight of what was happening. He thought about his teammates, probably asleep now in their dormitory rooms, unaware that one of their own was spending the night in jail for something he didn't do. He thought about his coach, a stern but fair man who demanded accountability from his players both on and off the field. How would this look? How would it be explained? Even if the charges were eventually dropped, the arrest itself would become part of his story, a data point that others could use to make judgments about his character. The night passed slowly, time stretching in the way it does when sleep is impossible and worry keeps the mind spinning. Derek finally dozed off sometime in the early morning hours, his body surrendering to exhaustion even as his thoughts continued racing. He dreamed of football fields and disappointed faces, of courtrooms and explanations that no one seemed willing to hear. Morning brought paperwork and procedures. Derek was informed that a blood sample and urine sample had been collected, which would be analyzed by the Georgia State Criminal Investigation Division. This was standard protocol in DUI cases, intended to provide forensic evidence that could either support or contradict the arresting officer's observations. Derek actually felt a measure of relief at this news. The tests would prove what he already knew. His blood would show no trace of any impairing substance because there was no impairing substance to find. He was released later that morning on his own recognizance, emerging from the detention facility into bright sunlight that seemed almost offensive after the fluorescent pallor of the cells. His car remained impounded at the police lot, requiring additional paperwork and fees to retrieve. A friend from the football team came to pick him up. The conversation during the drive back to campus filled with awkward silences and questions that Derek couldn't fully answer. Word traveled quickly in a place like Millbrook. By that afternoon, Derek's arrest was common knowledge on campus and beyond. The coaching staff summoned him for a meeting that afternoon, their expressions grave as they explained that he was being suspended from team activities pending resolution of the charges. University administrators followed suit, placing holds on his enrollment status while an internal review was conducted. In the span of less than 24 hours, Derek Holloway had gone from being a responsible student-athlete with a promising future to being a pariah whose mere presence on campus seemed to generate whispers and sideways glances. It didn't matter that he maintained his innocence. It didn't matter that the breath test had shown 0 alcohol. What mattered, in the court of public opinion, was that he had been arrested. And in our society, arrest implies guilt, even when it proves nothing of the sort. The waiting was perhaps the worst part. Derek attended classes when he was permitted to do so, trying to maintain focus on academics, even as his athletic and social worlds crumbled around him. He spoke with his parents daily, their voices carrying a mixture of concern and confusion that made him feel simultaneously loved and helpless. They offered to hire a lawyer to come up to Millbrook and advocate on his behalf, but Derek asked them to wait. The test results would come back. The truth would emerge. He just needed to be patient. For those of you who have stuck with this story so far, I want to acknowledge something that you might be feeling. It's frustrating to watch injustice unfold, to see someone who has done nothing wrong suffer consequences that they don't deserve. That frustration is appropriate. It's a healthy response to a system that sometimes prioritizes process over justice, authority over accuracy, institutional protection over individual rights. If stories like this make you angry, good. Hold on to that anger. Channel it into awareness and advocacy for reforms that might prevent similar situations in the future. The state laboratory results arrived approximately 3 weeks after Derek's arrest, forwarded to both the prosecutor's office and Derek's hastily retained defense attorney. The report was comprehensive, covering a panel of substances including alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, opioids, benzodiazepines, and various other compounds that can impair driving ability. Every single test came back negative. Derek Holloway's blood and urine showed absolutely no trace of any impairing substance. He had been, as he maintained from the very beginning, completely sober on the night of his arrest. The relief Derek felt upon receiving this news was profound, but complicated. On one hand, he was vindicated. The objective evidence confirmed what he had always known, what he had tried to tell Officer Whitfield that night in the parking lot. On the other hand, this vindication had come at enormous cost. 3 weeks of suspension from the football team had set back his development and jeopardized his starting position. His academic standing remained under review. His reputation in the campus community had been severely damaged by rumors and speculation. And perhaps most infuriatingly, the arrest itself remained on his record. Even with negative test results, even with the prosecutor's office moving to dismiss the charges, the fact of the arrest would follow Derek Holloway for years to come. Every background check, every job application, every professional licensing inquiry would potentially surface this incident, requiring explanation and inviting doubt. The prosecutor filed what's known as a nolle prosequi, a Latin phrase meaning "we will no longer prosecute." It was an acknowledgement that the case against Derek Holloway had no merit, that continuing to pursue charges would be a waste of resources and an injustice to the accused. But this administrative resolution, while welcome, fell far short of what Derek and his family believed he deserved. Where was the acknowledgement of wrongdoing by Officer Whitfield? Where was the apology from the Millbrook Police Department? Where was the recognition that a young man's life had been upended by a decision that should never have been made? The department's official response came in the form of a press release that seemed almost deliberately crafted to avoid accountability. A spokesperson acknowledged that the charges against Derek Holloway had been dismissed, but maintained that the arresting officer had acted appropriately based on the information available at the time. An internal review had been conducted, the spokesperson explained, and Officer Whitfield had been counseled regarding documentation procedures. Documentation procedures. That was the extent of the official acknowledgement. Not that the arrest was unjustified. Not that a sober young man had been handcuffed and jailed on the basis of one officer's faulty judgment. Just that the paperwork could have been better. This response illustrated something profound about the way police accountability often works, or rather fails to work, in our society. When officers make decisions that destroy lives, the institutional response is frequently to address peripheral issues while ignoring the fundamental problem. Officer Whitfield had arrested a demonstrably innocent person. That fact seemed beyond dispute. Yet the consequences he faced amounted to a reminder to fill out forms more thoroughly in the future. Let me be clear about something. I'm not suggesting that all police officers are bad actors or that the institution of law enforcement is irredeemably corrupt. Most officers are decent people trying to do a difficult job under challenging circumstances. But the system within which they operate often fails to hold individuals accountable when they exercise poor judgment or act on unfounded suspicions. And until that system changes, stories like Derek Holloway's will continue to occur with depressing regularity. Derek's reinstatement to the football team came slowly, the coaching staff citing the need to ensure all administrative matters were fully resolved before allowing him to return to competition. He missed 4 games in total, watching from the stands as his replacement handled kicking duties with mixed results. When he finally returned to the active roster, it was to a changed landscape. His starting position was no longer guaranteed. His relationship with certain teammates, who had been too quick to believe the worst about him, remained strained. The university eventually cleared his academic standing, though the process required multiple hearings and submissions of documentation that seemed designed more to protect the institution than to serve the student. Derek completed his studies that semester with the grim determination of someone who has learned that justice is not automatic, that vindication is not always sufficient, and that systems built to protect can sometimes be the greatest threats of all. What should we take away from Derek Holloway's experience? There are several lessons worth considering, each of them relevant to anyone who might find themselves subject to the enormous discretionary power that law enforcement officers wield in our society. First, doing the right thing doesn't guarantee that you'll be treated fairly. Derek called to report an accident because he believed in accountability and responsibility. That call initiated an encounter that led to his wrongful arrest. This doesn't mean we should stop doing the right thing. It means we should recognize that our moral choices don't obligate others to respond with equivalent fairness. Second, objective evidence can be subordinated to subjective interpretation when authority figures have already reached conclusions. Derek passed every field sobriety test. He blew 0 on the breath test. None of this mattered because Officer Whitfield had apparently decided that this young man was impaired and was determined to find evidence supporting that conclusion. This is a fundamental problem with field sobriety testing as currently administered, a problem that affects countless individuals every year. Third, the consequences of wrongful arrest extend far beyond the immediate experience of detention. Derek's reputation, athletic career, and academic standing were all jeopardized by an arrest that should never have occurred. Even after vindication, these effects lingered. The arrest remained on his record. The whispers continued. The damage, while partially mitigated, could never be fully undone. Fourth, institutional accountability for police misconduct is often inadequate or non-existent. Officer Whitfield faced no meaningful consequences for arresting an innocent person. The department's response focused on procedural details rather than the substantive failure of judgment that led to the wrongful arrest. This pattern repeats itself across law enforcement agencies throughout the country, creating a culture where officers face little personal risk for making bad decisions that devastate the lives of citizens. I want to close by asking you to consider something. What would you have done in Derek Holloway's situation? If you were a college student who had just been arrested for something you absolutely knew you didn't do, how would you have responded? Would you have maintained your composure as Derek did? Would you have been able to stay patient while waiting for test results that you knew would exonerate you? Would you have been able to return to your daily life, knowing that people around you harbored suspicions based on nothing more than the fact of your arrest? These are not hypothetical questions for the people who find themselves in situations like Derek's. They are lived realities, daily challenges that demand resilience and strength that no one should have to summon in response to injustice. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the power dynamics between citizens and law enforcement, if it made you question assumptions about guilt and innocence, then I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe to this channel and share this video with others who might benefit from hearing it. Stories like Derek's need to be told, not because they're sensational or entertaining, but because they reveal truths about our systems that too often remain hidden from those who haven't experienced them directly. Our rights don't disappear simply because someone in authority decides to disregard them. Our innocence doesn't become guilt simply because an officer makes a determination unsupported by evidence. These principles should be self-evident, yet they require constant vigilance and advocacy to maintain. Derek Holloway eventually graduated from Ashford College with a degree in business administration. He completed his football career with modest success, his disrupted season making it difficult to attract attention from professional scouts. Today, he works in his father's construction business back in Florida, building a life far removed from the parking lot where his trajectory was so dramatically altered. He still doesn't drink, he still doesn't smoke or use drugs. He remains the person his parents raised him to be, responsible and principled, and committed to doing things the right way. But he carries with him now a knowledge that many acquire only through painful experience, the knowledge that being innocent is not always enough. That authority can be wielded arbitrarily and without consequence, that the systems we trust to protect us can sometimes become the instruments of our unjust suffering. If you found this story valuable, I'd encourage you to look at the other content on this channel where we examine cases of civil rights violations, police misconduct, and systemic injustice. These stories matter because they affect real people living real lives. They matter because awareness is the first step toward change. And they matter because someday any one of us could find ourselves standing in a parking lot, having done everything right, watching our lives begin to unravel at the hands of someone who has decided, without evidence or justification, that we are guilty of something we didn't do. What would you have done differently in Derek's situation? Do you believe the system provided adequate accountability for what happened to him? I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you think others should hear this story, please share it on your social media platforms. The more people understand about how these situations unfold, the better equipped we all are to advocate for a more just system. Thank you for staying with me through this entire account. Until next time, remember that vigilance is the price of liberty, and that the rights we fail to defend today may not be there to protect us tomorrow.